we can talk about TLAMs and military, but I think economic pressure on Russia will be what unlocks it. There's a bit massive sanctions were announced yesterday, up to 50% of oil exports, 30% of Russian government revenue. And I think the key takeaway I took today was the Coalition of Willing's ambition to take all Russian oil, gas off the market by themselves.
Well, John Foreman is a former defence attache at the British Embassies in Kyiv and Moscow and joins us now. John Foreman, welcome to the programme. The work of the Coalition of the Willing, we seem to have a lot of meetings and a lot of talking, but obviously for President Zelensky, the important thing is whether action follows those meetings. What do you think?
Yeah, hello, Caroline. I mean, I think, as Kurt Volker said, is it the Coalition of the Willing or the Coalition of the Waiting until Trump decides what to do? I mean, we've been waiting since March to say what is the Coalition of the Willing actually willing to do. I think early on it was a sort of more military organisation, should we say, about what would happen about force going into Ukraine after a ceasefire. But I think it's slightly more into a political ginger group to try and bring together European voices, NATO, the European Union and the European nations together to show political solidarity with Zelensky and also to support them. But of course, we come to these meetings a lot of times and we anticipate big announcements and then not much else happens and we will move on. The caravan moves on to wait what Trump does next.
And indeed, in the last day or so, we have seen European leaders raising the prospect of doing something with those frozen Russian assets, but they weren't able to agree on how to act on them. The Belgians had vetoed it, saying that they didn't want to face any future fines if Russia decided to take action against them. So, it feels sometimes like there are lots of good ideas there, but when it comes to actually seeing them through, well, as you say, there's a lot of waiting and a lot of talking rather than willing.
Yeah, I mean, on frozen assets, I mean, I dug out the statement from the 21st of October, Monday, whatever that was, about the Coalition of the Willing. And it spoke, one of the things there was about frozen assets. And as you say, since then, Belgium sort of blocked it. The Europeans discussed it. The Americans have said they want to do it.
And John Foreman, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we have just seen that the Coalition of the Willing news conference is starting. Well, there you heard the Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the Ukraine President Zelensky answering questions after that news conference, which had the leaders of the coalition speaking in order. Keir Starmer, Zelensky, then Mark Rutte, the Secretary General from NATO. Then you had Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister, followed by the Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof. Essentially, Keir Starmer summing it up there, saying that we are all working together with Donald Trump in the United States. Discussions are ongoing about long-range missiles, but we know that so far Donald Trump has not given way on issuing Tomahawk weapons. The sanctions package, Keir Starmer said, that has been put in place by the United States is very significant, and the idea of doing something on those Russian assets, of course, there's a bit of a stalemate at the moment, but Keir Starmer said we need progress on a short timetable, which would provide further support for Ukraine if the proceeds from those assets could be used. Finally, he said we want to take Russian oil and gas off the world market. Now, of course, two oil companies in Russia have been hit by the American sanctions. China and India have both said that they will pause their purchasing of oil, but we need to see where that goes from there. President Zelensky was keen to say we are not seeking to finish this war without the United States because Putin wants to divide us. But he did say that at the end, talking about security guarantees, we need the United States. So quite a lot to go through there. I welcome back John Foreman, the former defence attaché at the British Embassies in Kyiv and Moscow. And apologies, John, I interrupted you at the start before we pressed on with that news conference. But do you feel that progress has been made, given what you've just heard over the last half hour?
Yeah, I think I was pretty much on the money where we're going to go. But I think this time it struck me that it was much more focused on support to Ukraine, sort of certain key areas. The Prime Minister mentioned up to the end of 2025. He talked both about sanctions, energy, money, arms, and placing pressure on Russia. I also thought the alignment was quite clear between the various bodies, the European Union and NATO and the members itself, which I think is important, both for Ukraine, but I think it's also important to send a message back to President Trump to say that Europe's on the same page and aligned with the United States. And I think the third thing I'd put out from that was, as I said, it started off as a sort of security organization, really, just to talk about security guarantees and presence of troops on the ground in Ukraine. And it's really moved on to a sort of political formation. There was very little on troops on the ground. I think that's jammed tomorrow. It's very much the here and now. How do we keep Ukraine fighting through the winter and into 2026?
Yeah, there was mention, wasn't there, from Keir Starmer about a multinational force eventually, presumably after a ceasefire, and Putin eventually brought to the negotiating table. I guess, though, we still don't have that firm commitment from Donald Trump, do we, on Tomahawk long-range missiles, which President Zelensky says are vital to obviously enhance Ukraine's war facilities, but also as part of diplomacy. Where do you think that goes?
I never thought that Trump would give Tomahawk to the Ukrainians. I think that there's a large number of people inside the administration who think that's escalatory. Trump sort of floated some ideas, but he backed away. Then he's actually doubled down on that as well. So I think today, although the Tomahawk question came up, I think the more interesting was about Ukrainian capabilities. How does the coalition really help Ukraine develop its own capabilities to strike Russian targets inside Russia? What other European and coalition assets are there which could enable Ukraine to strike those targets? We've talked about Storm Shadow, we've talked about Scalp from the French. What about Taurus from the Germans? Is this time the Germans will finally give those missiles to the Ukrainians? And we know from the NATO meeting last week there are other talks about long-range missiles, not just Tomahawk, but a thing called JASM, the Joint Standoff Missile, which also gives Ukraine an extra range to strike military targets closer to Ukraine. So there's a sort of cornucopia of different assets to strike targets. But I think TLAM is unlikely at this stage.
Well, yes, and Keir Starmer was talking about the acceleration of a missile building programme from the UK as well. But essentially, I suppose the question is, despite President Zelensky saying, essentially, we are not going to finish this war without the United States, Putin wants to divide us. Do you think that here we were seeing Europe basically coming to the conclusion that they may have to do it alone, that they may have to provide the weaponry and the support to Zelensky that isn't yet forthcoming from the United States? Or do you think that Donald Trump will come forward with more?
I mean, Trump has taken a very transactional position. He's selling arms to Europeans for Europeans to pass to Ukraine. And we know that he didn't provide direct weapons to the Ukrainians. He's also balked on sanctions until yesterday or the day before. I mean, I think the direction of travel has been clear for Trump that Europe has to do more, both for its own security inside NATO, but also for Ukraine. And I think on that, he's right. Ukraine is a predominantly European problem. It's up to Europeans, a population of 500 million people, including the UK, to do more. But I don't think we want to go down the path of basically washing our hands to the Americans, because the Americans are, quote, to use the statement from the traitors, the celebrity traitors, they are the big dog here. It's America with pressure, which will bring eventually Putin to the table. I think the Dutch Prime Minister mentioned economics. I think we can talk about TLAMs and military, but I think economic pressure on Russia will be what unlocks it. There's a bit massive sanctions were announced yesterday, up to 50% of oil exports, 30% of Russian government revenue. And I think the key takeaway I took today was the coalition willing's ambition to take all Russian oil, gas off the market by themselves, more sanctions by the European Union, but also urging others to do the same. And I think that's a concerted military pressure, financial pressure, economic pressure on Russia may be the one which budges it. And as we've seen, Putin sent his envoy to Washington to try and get Trump to back down on both sanctions and also to restart dialogue with Putin.
Yes, I mean, I was struck by that the desire to take Russian oil and gas off the world market. But how much more is there to take off? We know that the two biggest oil companies have faced those sanctions now. How much more is there, and what impact would that have on Putin, do you think?
Well, I understand from Lukoil and Rosneft, it's 50% of Russian oil exports. So there's obviously another 50% from somewhere which needs to be got after. And I think, there's also all sorts of tricks the Russians are using to try and get their stuff to market. So I think it's not just on sanctions, but also on enforcement and dealing with people who avoid sanctions, these third parties. But the other problem, of course, for Russia is if you can't get the stuff to market, or you can't get new markets, especially if India and China and Turkey start to budge, the question will ever be is have to flog it on the market at a discount, which again drives down revenues, which also exacerbates the Russian budget problem. So again, it won't be a single, I think, magic bullet. It'll be, and now the US Treasury is involved, which has been the thing which is the missing. They can go after both the production, they can go after the exports, they can go after the intermediaries, and they can go after the avoiders. And I think that's all good news.
John Foreman, former defence attache at the British Embassies in Kyiv and Moscow, thank you very much for your time